All right, this week on the podcast, I'm joined by Len Edgerly. Len is a longtime podcaster, has a podcast called The Kindle Chronicles with over 715 episodes, been doing it for 15 years. Funny story how we met. I'll let you get to the full podcast for that part, but had an awesome conversation with him. He interviews authors on his podcast on a semi-weekly basis, but he's also interviewed Jeff Bezos and a lot of Amazon executives, so he has that kind of connection too with the Kindle and everything. Awesome conversation, awesome guy. Think you'll really enjoy it. So this is the Randy Forster podcast. If you can do me a favor, you can subscribe on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. Would really appreciate that. And check us out on social media on Instagram and Facebook. That'd be cool too. So appreciate all the support. Thanks again for listening. Here's Len. All right, I'm joined by Len Edgerly. Len has a podcast called The Kindle Chronicles, has a lot more episodes than what I have, up to over 700 now, about 15 years, an old pro. So I'm happy to have you on, Len. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be here, Randy.
So we actually got connected through a podcast that I did with a John LaLiberty, who has a real estate project going on in Biddeford that you were thinking about getting involved in at the time. We had a nice long phone conversation about Biddeford, Maine, where I'm from. And it wasn't until the end that you said you had a podcast. I was like, oh, that's cool. And then I looked it up and I've been following it since. And I was like, you know what? I'd love to have Len on the podcast to talk about your podcasting journey. Also get some tips from you too. So
Good.
Hopefully you're ready for me.
I am.
So tell me about the podcast. Like I said, over 700 episodes, 15 years, Kindle Chronicles. How did that all get started? What made you want to do that?
You know, it kind of snuck up on me. I went to an event. It was called Blogs and Dogs in Banff, Canada. Mm-hmm. I had probably retired. I worked at a gas company out in Denver, and I was kind of just looking around for how I was going to spend my time. And so there was going to be about, how do you do a good blog? Plus, there were going to be dog sled rides in the snow in Banff. So what's not to like? And the first night there was a guy who had a little portable recorder, and he's interviewing people at the reception. And I said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, this is for a podcast. I said, well, what's a podcast, And he kind of set me on it. And that night in my room, I made a little podcast of my own. And then I was just experimenting with it. I had something called the Pod Chronicles or different things. And I would just put up interviews, but I didn't really have a topic. But I was learning microphones, how to record, how to use lips, and all the little elements of it, which turned out to be great preparation because when the Kindle came out in 2007, it just hit a lot of my buttons. I'd always loved tech. I've always been a reader and a writer. And the idea that this was sort of the future of books and reading, it was kind of like, oh, that's what my podcast is going to be about. And I'll call it the Kindle Chronicles, and I'll talk to people about the Kindle. But I could do it once a week for the rest of my life because I'm so excited about this. And so that's how it started. July 26, 2008 was when the first show was. I was at our cottage up in Ocean Park, Maine, and say, hey, this is episode 1 of the Kindle Chronicles. And I just put up episode 715 last week.
Yeah. I listened to it. There are not a lot of podcasts that have that type of numbers of episodes. So, yeah. 715 is quite a show of consistency, dedication. But like you said, you found a topic that you latched onto and love. And like you said, you could be doing this for the rest of your life. I read an article said you hope to get to 1,000, or you hope to do it to 2044 when you're 4 years old.
Why not?
Well, why not? But it is not as much work as people think. If you like talking to people, it's something that's enjoyable, and it's not like it takes me 10 hours a week to produce an episode. And it's probably not the same for you, but getting back to that beginning part, you had no awareness of what podcasts were before that moment.
Yeah, right.
I think they had been around for a couple of years, and I honestly forget how I interacted with podcasts back then, because right now I listen on Spotify and it's super easy, but I believe it was still easy at the time. But I was very into podcasts back then.
Did you listen to Adam Curry, or who did you listen to?
I listened to Adam Carolla, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Adam Carolla, he had I haven't listened to him in years, but he was one of the first people that had like a really well produced, almost like felt like a talk show, but for podcasts, and you knew what you were getting every time. Had recurring guests and kind of side co-hosts and all that stuff. So, and then I listened to a guy by the name of Bill Simmons. I don't know if you ever heard of Bill Simmons, but he's a sports guy. So those are two guys I've been listening to for probably as long as you've been doing podcasts, because I was kind of in on the ground floor as well. But I wonder what your setup was at the time. Was it just this mic, like a mic setup, and you kind of interview people in person, and then?
I think the first one, I was pretty much doing it remotely, probably by Skype. It seems like my first microphone I remember was a blue snowball mic, pretty inexpensive, but decent quality. And yeah, most of them, Bertunde Thurston was my first guest, and I'm sure I was talking to him on Skype and recording it that way with my setup and just feeding the USB mic into my Mac laptop. And I was using maybe GarageBand in those days, or so I had the basics of it, and then any chance I get to buy a new microphone, I'll do it now. So
I know you have a great voice for podcasts. People, I'm sure, have told you that before, so I'm jealous. After 715 episodes, you've had a ton of guests. I've noticed there's some people that are kind of recurring guests for you. Had on a few times. Outside of the Amazon side of things, which we will get to, as far as just authors that you focus on, is there some people that really strike you as being very memorable?
There's been a number. I had a chance to interview a poet that I admired, John Ashbery, who passed away a couple of years ago. That was quite a moment. Another one that I've had on a few times, that Dean Koontz, who's, I think he sold 500 million books in his career. He's in his 70s. And I hadn't read anything by him. I knew the name, but through Amazon Publishing, I got connected with him because he was one of the people Amazon was, or the kind of people Amazon was hoping would switch from the big five publishers to Amazon Publishing, which is their imprint. And I think Dean Koontz is the biggest fish they ever landed because he's huge. And so the first time I interviewed him, he was out in California. I just liked him. He was very quirky and wry, unpredictable. I think those are guests I remember the most as ones that kind of surprised me.
Yep.
And then he's very prolific. So he'd have another book come out and they'd say, "Hey, Len, you want to talk to Dean again?" I've talked to him about 3 times. I think I'm supposed to talk to him again with another book coming up. So it gets to be one of these things where, I mean, we're not friends, but we know each other. And I think he enjoyed talking to me and I enjoyed talking to him. He did a lot of talking about his golden retrievers. And that's also the interview, as I remember it now. I think it was one of the most painful interviews I had at one point because I made the mistake of thinking I was more important to him than I was. That, Dean Koontz and I, like we grok each other, we're into this. And I don't know, the topics get a little personal. Maybe we're talking about getting old or dogs or something. And when I finished, I just felt embarrassed. I felt like, I got caught out somewhere I don't like to be. And I remember we were up at Ocean Park in the time, and I told my wife, I said, "Oh God, I think I just blew an interview here." And then when I listened to it, it was fine. Anybody that hadn't been in my head would have thought, well, that was just kind of a, good interview, interesting. So, that's funny that he would show up when you ask memorable interviews, partly because it was one of the ones I had the hardest time sleeping after I had done it. And then it turned out to be fine,
I have to laugh because I've had those similar type things on, I'm sure, much different or maybe smaller scale where I like, man, that interview went awful. Like, I feel like I should apologize for the way that went. And then, through editing, it's not as bad. And then people will see me someplace and be like, "Oh, I listened to your podcast with so-and-so. It was great." I was like, "Really?" I'm like, "Oh, terrible." So I guess we are just super hard on ourselves sometimes. And, you never know. Like you said, no one's in your head at the time, but I've been there. So I say Dean as if I know him, but Dean Koontz is the name that I recognize, or one of the names I recognize going through the list. And notice that you had him on a bunch of times. So it's interesting to hear that it sounds like Amazon helps with part of the booking process too, or yeah.
Yeah. In those days, I had a good relationship with the people at Amazon Publishing, and I love Amazon Publishing. I think that the things that they've been doing, especially for someone who's a big fan of ebooks like I am, they're pricing them right. It's the big five are selling ebooks at ridiculous prices, $15 for something that it costs them $0 to print another copy of. So Amazon Publishing was just kind of I really appreciated them. So when they would have somebody that I think Patricia Cornwell, they were landing some pretty big names, and they would reach out to me and say, hey, do you want to talk to this person?
Mhm.
What I found about booking with authors is that when an author has a book out or it's about to come out, they're very open to being on anybody's show. I mean, all of their events are not on The View or the Today Show. If you say, I've got a podcast, it's a real podcast, I've had a few guests that you might recognize, can I talk to you about your book? 95% of the time, the answer is yes. And, I reached out to Neil deGrasse Tyson recently thinking, I don't think I'm going to get him on the show because he's really well known. And yeah, sure enough, after some iterations with the publicist, it was set up. And I've had other kinds of guests. What I love about the podcast, since I don't have to, it doesn't put food on the table or anything. It's basically a hobby. I can see an article by somebody on the internet and think, boy, that's a really interesting thing, and just reach out to the person and say, read your article and I've got a podcast, I'd like to talk to you. So those aren't, that's maybe 50% of those pan out. But I've never run out of ideas or opportunities for guests, and I've always been grateful that so many people have just said yeah. And they never ask, well, how many listeners do you have? What are your metrics? No, if I reach out and in my approach, I show that I'm familiar with their work, and that a lot of people just think, boy, somebody that's done me the honor of asking about my work and wants to talk about it, what's not to like about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering about Neil deGrasse Tyson in particular, because that's a guy that is very, very well known.
Yeah.
And he's on, I feel like he's been on Joe Rogan podcast before, some of those big podcasts with millions and millions of listeners. But like you said, you just reach out, you have a certain approach. Obviously, you have 700 and something episodes at this point, and talk to Jeff Bezos, so there's a certain amount of credibility there. But I have found, even on my much smaller level, that people just appreciate the opportunity to talk about themselves, or share a story, or share their wisdom, or things that they've learned over the years. So I'm not as surprised as I used to be, but earlier in the process, I was definitely surprised by how many people said yes when I asked them to talk for a half hour. I mean, it's not that the barrier to doing it is not that big anyways. You just got to dedicate a half hour, and have a webcam. And so it's been cool that those people have been open to that too. But on the complete opposite side of things, you're interviewing local level authors or people that are much smaller. Right. Who was the gentleman that I think I emailed you about the other day? I think it was Nick Fuller Guggen, maybe. Another more recent episode for a local Maine author, but that was great. Totally different than Neil deGrasse Tyson or Dean Koontz, but I also found that interesting as well.
Yeah, that one I recorded on the sidewalk outside Elements, and I really enjoyed that one. And the other thing I've learned, or I think I went into this thinking, well, a best-selling author is like a different category of fish, of an author that's maybe self-published or smaller publisher. But I've so rarely had a bad author interview that I end up thinking, anybody who has worked for a year or however long it takes to write a book, they have done something worth listening to, and it doesn't matter how many millions of copies they sold. It's unusual for someone to do that. And so, and then I read the book, and I do a lot of preparation. I like preparing almost as much as I like doing the interviews. And, Nick's a good example. I mean, he's an established author. He's on his way. And, but it was just fun to talk to his process, about his process. And it feels like just kind of an honor to be able to talk to an author, because I've never written a book myself, and I tend to still look up at people that have said, yeah, I'm going to write a book, and then they actually do it. These are people worth listening to.
Agree 100%. I think writing a book is still a big accomplishment in anyone's life. And I had a friend on the podcast, one of my earlier episodes, who had written a book himself, and I was just so proud of him. And I just was so happy to have him come on to talk about what that whole process was like and what the book was about. And there's a level of commitment to it that I still don't fully understand, even talking to him or listening to some of the interviews that you did. It's quite a thing. So one of the things that struck me about Nick in particular's interview was I don't know if it's the editing process or I'm probably using the wrong words, but there was talk of, if you remember, they had McDonald's still in this world that
Yeah.
he was talking about, and how he alluded to like nuggets, but he didn't say what kind of nuggets they were. And then I think the person that was editing had questions just about the thought process, and like you're really trying to like make sure things are consistent and that they make sense. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing that there's people that would read that work and have that type of suggestions. But I guess that's what it is when you're writing a fiction book.
Yeah, I was impressed with that too.
Yeah.
The level of, and that's a big book. So, the work they put into getting the right description of the nuggets was just one part of a really long project.
It was just amazing that someone like reading it and was like, you know what, I got to make sure that we're consistent on like what kind of nuggets these are.
Yeah.
And if you listen to the interview, I'll probably share that specific interview when I post this. It just made me think like, wow, this is cool. And I did ultimately buy his book. I think I might have mentioned
Good,
as well.
good. I always love it when the author is rewarded with at least one sale of a book from talking with me.
I love it. Do you try to read? I mean, it'd be overwhelming to read the book every time before the interview, or is that what you do?
I do. I can't remember a time when I've had an author on that I didn't actually finish the book. I've had times when I started a book and I had just a few times and I didn't like the book. So I called, reached out to the publicist and says, I just don't think this is for me and I'm going to have to bow out of the interview.
No.
But if I've committed to it and I've done enough prep to think, yeah, this is something I want to read. I think that's just from my education. I mean, in high school, I went to a prep school in the Boston area, and the idea that you would try to turn in a paper or do anything without having read the book, I mean, you might as well just go drive off a bridge if you're going to be that kind of a person. So it's kind of built in.
It's a silly question, actually, that I ask you in hindsight, because of course, I mean, this is the Kindle Chronicles. You're having authors on talk about their books like as if you would not have read them and as if you would even admit to it, right?
Right. I may have just made up that last answer.
But yeah, no, it obviously makes sense. But it's cool. I guess it gives you something to focus on reading between episodes. Looks like your cadence is every couple weeks you do an episode.
Well, when I set myself free from the weekly every Friday, for a while I thought maybe once a month, and now it's unpredictable. I think I went 2 or 3 months before I did the Neil deGrasse Tyson one, and I'm just waiting for an opportunity to talk to somebody, and if they come every week, that's fine, and if they come every 5 months, that's fine too. So it's going to be episodic.
To shift gears a little bit, you also focus on Amazon products, and you have this relationship with Amazon. So I want to talk a little bit about that. But actually, before I get to that point, what is it that you loved about the Kindle in particular? But you obviously named the podcast after, but there was a love of this Amazon product when you started. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it started a little before that, and there was a device called the Rocketbook, and it was an electronic book, and it came out, I don't know, 2-3 years before the Kindle. I think Amazon might have tried to buy the company, and I just thought this is so right, to put a book in your hand, and I think, man, that book that product could hold 10 books at a time, if you can imagine, as opposed to 1,000 on a Kindle now. So I got really excited about it, and I was on a board, the Western States Arts Federation, kind of an regional arts agency based in Denver where I was living. And at the end of the meetings, and these are kind of impressive gatherings of people, they'd say, okay, does everybody have something they want to kind of show and tell for, that's of interest to them? And I had my Rocketbook, and I held my Rocketbook up, and I said, this is going to change everything. This thing is like, it's a digital book. I mean, and they're at that time to say, okay, yeah, Len, he's always excited about something. But I felt like I had sort of, stepped out, and the Rocketbook failed. It just didn't go anywhere. And then when Amazon said, well, we have something called the Kindle, I kind of went, well, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And it took a while for me to think, and I didn't get one right away. So I had to wait because there was 6 months where you couldn't buy them. And then when I got it, I thought, oh, yeah, this is it. And I think it's just because I've always loved gadgets and I've always loved reading. So it's like if you had two girlfriends, that were really different and somehow they just became the same girlfriend. It's like you'd go crazy, you'd lose your mind. And that's kind of what happened.
Amazon seems like the right company to bring the Kindle to market. Who is the Rocket Book associated with? Was it like a Barnes and Noble's product, or just like a totally different third party type company? Or
I think it was third party. It was like Nouveau Media, and they got acquired by somebody. Some of the players in that, I don't know if they ended up working for Tesla. There's some names, if you go back and look at that were notable. And I think it was just a little too early. And by the time Amazon developed the first Kindle was sort of a laugh. I mean, it had this strange wheel that you would use to move, and it looked like, somebody said, it looked like it had been designed by Soviet engineers in the 50s. Just like, it was not pretty. But and so it it evolved over time, and yeah, that's fun to remember those days.
but it is a great product, and I have one too. I got a bunch of books on it. I do love it. I love that I can read it at the beach or poolside someplace, and it
Yeah.
doesn't matter the angle of the sun. You can read it great, and everything, whatever you're feeling, you can bounce back and forth between books and make notes and all that sort of stuff. So it is a great product. So I could see why you fell in love with it and named the podcast after. But it also led to this relationship with Amazon, or quasi relationship with Amazon. Yeah. I think you've interviewed over 50 executives, done a bunch of product reviews. Even interviewed Jeff Bezos. So actually, what was that like, the Jeff Bezos situation? You've interviewed him a couple times, haven't you? A few times?
Yeah. Once in 2016, they reached out to me. At that point, I'd been doing the show for a while and said, would you like to come to Seattle and interview Jeff Bezos? And I said, well, let me check my calendar first. I don't know if I might be busy. I said, yeah, right. I'll be right out. And he was a nice guy. I think I was expecting some kind of a master of the universe, but he showed up. I think he had a yogurt, and we were in this conference room that looked like a classroom at a community college somewhere, nothing fancy at all. And it was a good conversation. I remember some of the details of, I had a recorder of some kind, and then I think I had a smartphone, probably an iPhone. And he said, well, what do you got going here? So, well, I've got, I've got this, and then I've got a backup in case, there's any kind of a problem. And he said, well, that's smart, and you could see him thinking, sort of evaluating the care with which I was getting ready for the interview. And I thought he was, I've interviewed some people from the corporate world, and I've worked in the corporate world. You can kind of feel that corporate voice coming at you sometimes. They've maybe been prepped. One of the clues that I've noticed is some people in a corporate environment, they say, that was a good question, but then they'll say it like 5 times in the interview. And I said, you need to go back to the coach. It's really kind of nice if you can acknowledge that a question is good. We all like to, but when you do it 5 times, but anyway, Bezos was not that way. I felt like I was kind of talking to a friend or somebody that didn't have an inflated idea of himself, and very intriguing, understanding and insight into how the Kindle came about. And it's a passion project. He's a reader, and his ex-wife is a novelist. So it was nice to have a sense of who he was as a person. And since at that point, I was really deep into the Kindle, it felt like, looking behind the curtain to find out, well, how did this thing come into the world? Well, it came into the world because a guy who's really smart and really hardworking, all this, and innovative, he just wanted it. And he wanted it to be, wireless. You don't have to plug it into your computer. You can buy books over the air. All of these things that he set out for that Lab 1 2016, kind of impossible things, which came out of his own passion for the thing. And that's always, I think the Kindle is really at the center of Amazon's DNA. And sometimes I worry, well, will they keep supporting it? And I'm sure as long as Jeff Bezos is alive, nobody at Amazon is going to say, hey, I get a great idea. We'll, sell the Kindle division to Rakuten or something. And it's just part of the makeup of the company.
Yeah. It seems like, what the iPhone is to Apple is what the Kindle is to Amazon. So that would be a sad day if that ever happened. But so every interaction you've ever had with him was related to the Kindle, obviously, like at a different time of different launches or different versions coming out of it.
Yeah. And I only had 2 interviews with him. I was hoping it was going to be every 4 years, but let's see. So if it was 2016, I probably reached out in 2020 and they said, no, he's too busy.
Yeah.
And, maybe I'll have a chance to talk to him once again.
Yeah.
So the 2 times I spoke with him were strictly Kindle related.
Yep. And you have done, I guess, product events over the years.
Those are so fun.
What's that been like?
Well, I remember the first Fire tablet that was in near San Diego, I think. And they're always exciting. I mean, it's kind of like an Apple launch, but when you're there and you get your little name tag and you go in and then afterward you get to play with the stuff and try them out. And in recent times, they've been a little more subdued, a little more sophisticated. The last one I went to in New York, what was that about anyway? There was at HQ2, and they were releasing. It was their new product launch, so they had a bunch of stuff. And the most exciting thing was they're going to be adding. I can't say her name because she's here. The ability to chat with A.
Yeah.
And so that was significant in some of the products as well.
So you'll go to like home product launches too, not just Kindle related stuff, but that line of home stuff or ring camera stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And they tend to think of me just as Kindle, but I got wind of this thing and I reached out to one of the people I've worked with and I said, hey, I'd love to go to that new products thing. And it turns out the word Kindle never get even mentioned at that thing, but there was still a lot to talk about.
And the most recent version of the Kindle was the Kindle Scribe.
Yeah. Oh God, I love that thing.
Do you love it? I haven't updated in a few years. I still have one of the just very plain, I guess, Kindles, but maybe it is time for a change. Is it very responsive? I know you can write on it now.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I do my journaling had kind of lapsed, but it's so fun to write, longhand on a journal on it. And then I can upload the stuff to my computer. I can print them out. I've got a great big thick binder of my journal pages. And sometimes if I'm at a meeting, I'll take notes. But then at the same time, I can read whatever Kindle book I'm reading. And it's kind of nice to have the 8x10 view of it. And then
so it's bigger.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's like an iPad.
Yeah. Let's see. So this has a nice case so it would be about the size of an iPad.
Yeah. So that's like, and it looks like it has one of those same type of screens as the
Kindle.
Any angle of lighting and all that stuff. It looks fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when I'm reading my Kindle books, and I've had other tablets. I tried the Remarkable. Kobo had one that I tried. There was one thing called Books, and they were all very elegant and nice. In some ways, nicer than the Scribe for writing. But the Scribe's the only one I can read my Kindle books on, so it wins without even breaking a sweat.
I'll have to check that out. I've never even held it. I mean, I wonder if they sell it in stores, or you have to only buy it off Amazon. Like a place like Best Buy, I know has like a section of Amazon products.
Yeah,
I don't know that I've ever actually seen the Scribe.
Yeah. I'd recommend it. I think you might love it.
Take a look at it. Awesome. Well, I have a question for you, and it's as a fellow podcast host. Do you have any tips for me that you can give me how to grow my podcast or improve my podcast or anything you've learned over the years?
Well, I think from my experience, a suggestion I would make is whatever you thought you were doing when you started the show, don't be afraid to abandon it or go in some new directions. Because in my case, it started out the Kindle and it was heavily in Amazon. And now it's just, I distilled it to, it's conversations that I like. And I can have a good conversation with anybody. And it doesn't ever have to mention the word Kindle. But it took a long time for me to sense what was the real driver that sparked joy, to use the Marie Kondo phrase. And so if you've got, and then the other thing that happened, I got a little tired. I always have tech tips. I'd have to come up with, Kindle, Amazon news, and the parts of the show that I just sort of started going through the motions on turned out not to be essential. And the parts of it that I loved just never disappointed me. And so, if you're going to be doing this another 5-10 years or until you're my age, I would bet that you'll find a path through it that leads to something that maybe wasn't evident to you when you first started out, or maybe even now.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I can kind of see that developing after, I think this will be 78 or 79. I definitely value the conversations, and I think that is the part that is consistent between all of the different episodes I do. It certainly just varies from topic to topic, but I do value the conversation. So we'll see. But it's been fun so far, and I can only hope that I can make it to 700 plus episodes like you. You know.
Well, how do you see your topic as Biddeford and Saco focus? There's a geographic thing that's essential for it.
I don't. There's definitely a lot of that, just given that's what I know. That's where I'm from, and that's a lot of the people I know are from there, or involved in the community, or in the area. But I don't know that I would want to do that on every episode.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that being the focus. I do mortgages. I may have told you in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always that real estate component of things. I enjoy sports and movies. So there's always like that component of things. A lot of people I work with are entrepreneurs and have businesses locally. So I want to promote their business and give them an opportunity to share their story. So it's, the only thing that is consistent between all those threads is just the fact that, to me, these people are interesting and have a story to tell, but it isn't all one topic.
I see.
So I feel like I'm probably a little bit limited in that sense in terms of like potential for growth, because everything that I read about podcasts, like their listeners have to know what to expect, I think, for the most part. And in my case, there isn't that. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what it's going to be. And I enjoy doing this and making new relationships. I mean, here we are. We probably wouldn't be having this conversation otherwise. Yeah. I've had a bunch of other conversations like that. I've gotten business through having my podcast, and maybe that's what it is for me. And it just ends up being a hobby for a while, but I am interested in growing, and, it's just kind of the way that I am. I like to see things move forward, so we'll see if I ever get there, but I'm still kind of finding what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I definitely understand what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. But there's a conference. Have you ever heard of this Agents of Change conference up in Portland?
I have.
I used to pick up ideas for promoting my show and at those kinds of events. And I get a lot of stuff from those podcasters events. And have you gone to any of those kinds of things?
No. Who's the person that runs that, Agents of Change? I feel like my brother knows that guy.
Yeah. I can picture him,
I don't want to put you on the spot. But anyways, I have heard about this. I have a personal connection to the person that I think runs it. Mm-hmm. And I think I do want to check some stuff out like that and do some networking in that and see where it goes. But thanks for mentioning it. And honestly, I appreciate you coming on, Lon. You're down in Florida right now, so taking the half hour to chat and kind of go through.
I could be playing pickleball right now, but that happened earlier. So,
do you play every day, or?
Oh yeah, my wife got me into it, and I love it. I played tennis when I was a kid, but I've never been an athlete. I got weak knees, but I put on my braces, and I laugh because sometimes it feels like it is a sport that you can play at any age, and I don't know if I've actually seen it, but I could imagine some old dude with his walker, going up to the edge of the court and then coming out. And some of these old guys, when they play, they don't run around. But if a ball comes anywhere near them, they will hit it back, and they will hit it back at a place that you're not standing in the court. And I thought, God, that's great. I could play this when I'm 90 years old and just have a ball.
And your wife can play. And so my dad plays every day, mostly. And I actually was supposed to go this morning and play with him, but I hurt my calf in a race last week. So I took the week off. But there's people all ages, and men and women. And there's a gentleman that plays where I play that is in a wheelchair. He's one of the best guys there.
He plays in the wheelchair?
He's in a wheelchair, one of those more like sports type wheelchair, but he can hit with both hands. When someone is playing in a wheelchair, they have one extra bounce to hit the ball. So instead of just one bounce, they have two, like you can bounce twice and they can hit it. But like, it's amazing what he can do. And what you think you need, like you think you need to be a good athlete to be good at it, and you really don't. Like obviously that helps, but you can get by just fine with accuracy and being able to hit it soft, and it's a ton of fun. So love it. Love that you play.
Good. Well, I look forward to, we did decide to buy one of those units that in John's company, it's going to be ready for us March of 2025. And so I hope our paths will cross when I'm a fellow resident up there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. I'm excited for you. So, I live close by. So maybe grab a cup of coffee at Elements where you met Nick, and would love to stay in touch. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Good. Me too. Thanks, Randy.
Awesome.